Hello, and welcome to another of the British Cartographic Society's Teatime Talks. My name is Chris Tributus. I am the coordinator for the Teatime Talks and will be today's chair. Today we had the pleasure of a talk from Mary Spence. Mary is a cartographic design consultant specialising in the redesign of problem maps. Her career spans nearly 50 years in cartographic publishing and was awarded an MBE in 2004 for services to cartographic design. She is a chartered geographer and Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and an honorary member of the British Cartographic Society. She has served the BCS in a range of roles, including President from 2006 to 2008, and has supported the BCS and counselled from behind the scenes for many years. Our talk today is From Pen to Pixel, the changing face of map production. We will hear how over nearly 5 decades of working with maps, Mary has seen the processes involved and how they have changed considerably. This will be a tale of adapting to these changes. I will now pass you over to Mary.
Well, hello. Thank you for joining us on this talk. You've heard about my background with the BCS. I'll tell you a little bit about how I come to be in this position of being a long-term cartographer. I did a degree in geography at Aberdeen with Mike Wood, and then I did a diploma in cartography at Glasgow University with John Keats. I then started off as a cartographic editor at Pergamon Press. That was for 2 years, and then when I was made redundant from there, I went to work for a small company in Henley called David Fry and Company. And that's where I learned about good design and the importance of getting maps properly done. There I stayed for many, many years. It was taken over in the 80s by a Lebanese company, and again I stayed for a long time. But finally I left to join Global Mapping, and I still do bits and bobs for Global Mapping, but I'm a freelance consultant now. I used to live in Oxford, hence the Pergamon Press connection. I now live on the borders of Wales in Herefordshire, near to the town of Hay-on-Wye. With my other half, Graham, his delightfully batty old mum, 2 dogs, Angus and Douglas, 3 cats, Maisie, William and Charlie. So there's never a dull moment. So over to my talk. I shall share my screen now. Right, pen to pixel. What I'm going to talk about here is the people involved way back then, the tools they used, the techniques they used, what happened when computers came along, and then what happened when GIS came along, and what might happen in the future. So let's start off with people. Back in the early days where I worked, and this is going to be a personal account for obvious reasons, having said I worked in the same place for a long, long time. Editors on one side, draftsmen in the other, and the footage technicians down in the dungeons. Editors would do the research, they would find the sources for the maps, they would do the compilations, which I'll explain later. They designed the map, that's the colours, the line weights, the shape, the layout, everything. They checked thoroughly that everything the draftsman did at every stage. They would manage the project from beginning to end, and they would probably deal with the client. The draftsman, on the other hand, by the way, the editors were normally graduates in geography or geography and cartography. The draftsmen were highly skilled technicians who'd gone a different route. They were scribing, which I'll explain later. They would make peelcoats, which I'll explain later. They would patch type. It was all very time consuming and labour intensive. And part of this process was aided by the photo technicians downstairs. Things were made into negatives, positives for printing and so on. And I'm just about to go through all that lot. The first thing that the editors had to do was collect the information. Back then, and we're talking the early 70s, there was no free data. You could use other people's mapping, such as Ordnance Survey or Collins Bartholomew, to name a couple. You could use them under license, but you had to pay. You could commission or buy aerial photography or satellite imagery. You could go out in the field and survey for yourself, or the client could supply you maps. If you wanted data such as weather information, you could go to the Met Office, or you could scour through libraries. Very, very labour intensive. This is just an example of when I worked for the Arab world, of some of the sources that we were provided with in doing an Atlas of the United Arab Emirates. You see on the left, there's some sort of geology map rolled up. There's town plans, there's aerial photography, satellite imagery, and for data, the Europa World Yearbook was a mine of information for each of the countries of the Arab world, and that's where we used to trawl for data to do diagrams and graphs and the like. Now, you can imagine how difficult it was gathering all that stuff and then putting it together on a map. But that wasn't the beginning of our trials. The trials started with root rings. There are many other brands of drawing pens, but we chose root rings. The repeatograph was fine. You replaced the cartridges. The isograph, you could refill it. Now, as you can see on the left, it came in lots of different sizes, but for the pen work we were doing, it was usually the 0.1, 0.13, 0.15 perhaps. All the bigger ones were a bit awkward, a bit clumsy, and a bit inky. And then there was all different colours of ink. But you can see from the diagrams there that life with a rotring pen was not without dangers. They were a devil to clean. You can see the gadget at the bottom there, what they call the pen cleaning unit, to remove dried or non-etching inks. It wasn't always as easy as that. You would wash it and shoke it and shake it, and you dismantle the pen, you'd put it back in, and it still didn't work. And only then would you think, stuff it, I'll have a new nib. But by then your patience was somewhat strained. So that was the pen that we used. And then in support of that, we had things like compasses where you could put the said dreaded pen. You had what we called radius curves or railway curves. You could see those in the middle, which you could use to get the lines nicely smooth. There's another set of drawing stuff down the bottom. There's typical set squares, rulers. Sometimes you could use a circle template. Or the curves, the French curves as we call them on the right hand side. Now often your source map wouldn't be the same size as the map you were doing, so that's where the proportional dividers, that evil looking gadget, second from the right, where you could take something from one source and scale it down to your map, so you could plot things by pinpricks in your map and then just join the dots. The other important gadget was, and it was a dreadful thing to use, but my gosh, it saved lots of time, was the Grant projector. You would put your source map down the bottom there, and using those two little wheels at either side, you would adjust it up and down till it came to the size of the map that you wanted, and you would have an outline of that map on the glass frame in front in that hooded thing, and you stick your head in there for hours at a time and trace off the information that you wanted. Oh, we had it easy back then, didn't we? And then there's the tools themselves. We used a product called Permatrace, which was a plastic matte coated, which was perfect for the pen and ink work. It was like a very upmarket tracing paper, but plastic and much more stable, so that it could be photographed and it wouldn't change size. The other essential tool was the scalpel for getting things cut to size. Got them ubiquitous linen tester. Everybody had to have a linen tester, and you'll see pictures of everybody pouring down these linen testers later on. And to hold all the sheets of film together, there was the Kodak punch register system. You took your bit of film and you put it in this contraption, and you punched holes in it by pushing the lever down, and then you registered them on that bar, which is between the contraption and the box. And this is similar to today when you have many layers in your graphics program, but we would have layers of film, different films, positives, negatives, masks, the lot. And the diagram on the right is just a modern day illustration of what layers are all about. Type on the top, next down is area colours, next down is roads, next down is drainage, and below all that is your administrative areas. It's a typical simple construction of a map. Of course, there are thousands of types of maps, and I can't possibly cover them all here, but it's just an inkling, a flavour of what we handled. Other tools that we had, and these I still have, would you believe, after all this time. That's a line gauge on film up there, and you can see the line thicknesses. The top left is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that's in thousands of an inch. We don't do thousands of an inch anymore, but that was how it was back then. it was funny, back then the sheet sizes were in inches, so you'd have a sheet of film 12 by 10 inches, say, or 16 by 20 or 20 by 24, but then your measurements would be in millimeters, and then your line gauges would be in thous. We got all confused. On the other side, at the bottom left, type chart in millimeters, we had those printed out on film so that when you were looking at your compilation, you could set that down on top of your maps and work out how big your type should be for that particular feature. On the right hand side, there's a modern day specification for what that might come out like. You know, the type styles are 7.8, 8.9 point. Types have always been in point sizes, so that hasn't changed. And then up above, when you come to design the colours, you've got these charts, the cyan, magenta and yellow charts, where we would have sheets like the one second from the right, and we would painstakingly fold over to isolate the colour we thought, then take another sheet that had a different colour with it and do the same, lay them all out in a row and see if that progression of colours worked well. It was good fun. Next to there is the Pantone colour chart, which if we were being really posh, or if the customer had company colours like Pantone colours, you could choose from there or match from there. And very conveniently, the Pantone colours had cyan, magenta, yellow equivalents on the back of the cards, so that if you fancied a colour in Pantone, you could then closely match it, but it wasn't always exact. Now, that was what the tools the editors had. Now we go to what the draftsman did. We called it fair drawing back yonder. They would scribe the line work. I'll show you what scribing is in a minute. Every feature would have a separate line. So for example, all the drainage would be on one scribe, because it was the same colour maybe. The roads would be on another, the administrative boundaries on another, and so on. And once you'd scribed the areas, say like you scribed contours, and you wanted to have different colours for every layer, you would make peel coats and peel a layer for each colour, for each zone that you wanted. And when you'd done that, you would get your type and symbols patching, and I'll go into how that happened later. And once your type and symbols had been approved, you would turn it to negative down in the darkroom. And then there was the duffing, which was great fun. The Plumtree liquid opaque was what we used, and you would dilute it with water, get your paintbrush. And I've got a lovely picture down the bottom right, courtesy of A to Z, who've actually got on their blog a picture of a negative with the little red spots where they've been duffed. And the reason negatives had to be duffed was because when the positive goes into the vacuum frame and the contact frame to be contacted to a negative, it would pick up bits of dust, and you wouldn't want these bits of dust coming up as black specks or blue specks on your finished map, so you would have to duff out those little dots. Once the draftsman did all this work, he would send down the materials to be combined in the drawing office, and the proof would be then going to the editor for checking. It would go back to the draftsman to do corrections. Final fills would be made, and he would touch those up before they went to press. Right, the tools the draftsman had were pretty much the same as we had, but they had even more fancy sets of curves called spline curves, where you could get any, like an S-bend, weights to hold down things at the top right corner. The bottom left picture is an example of a tripod cutter that I still have. You would put a sapphire cutter in there, and going back to that line gauge that I showed you earlier, those sapphire cutters were made so that they would cut a line or 2 lines or 3 lines or 5 lines to that required thickness. And some of the wider ones were pretty tricky for the draftsman to scribe with. Shows how skilled they were. And then the other diagram on the right, when we were drawing things, the compilation with pen and ink, we would use Rotring pens. The draftsman had special dip pens, and you can see a selection of those there, and each draftsman would have his favourite dip pens. The brush is for brushing away dust, the ever-present nonsense, and the steel rules, we always used those because they were more accurate than the plastic jobs. The white thing in the middle is for boning down the type. which we'll see in a minute. There's also much, I can't show you it all at once, so you'll have to keep some of this in brain so you can see what's happening later on. But here we have a picture of Dave scribing. I think that's a roads map of one of the canal maps that we used to do. And linen tester, eye close up, he's scribed his lines using a tripod. And then he's just going in there and touching them up, making sure that they're as neat and blemish-free as he can. Now, to go back a bit to how these layers that I mentioned earlier were constructed. That's a sheet of film 10 by 12, and you can see the little punch holes at the top. The frame and the coast and the rivers of that bit of England with the Isle of Wight there, that's one film. And that would be the compilation that the draftsman had done using his rotring pens. He may have done them in different colours so the frame was black, but not necessarily. That wasn't always necessary because there was a specification written up later on which would tell the draftsman what thickness and what colour to make the lines. And then he would draw the roads, compile the roads, and that layer would fit on top of the other one on the pin bar, but the source would be underneath, say like an ordnance survey map if that's what he was copying, or other sources. And then the one on the right is just the type and symbols. Now I've cheated there, that's a typeset type and symbols because I haven't got a compilation from way back then. But that's what it would have looked like, pretty much. Then once the scribing is done, the area colours are created using peelcoats. Coming to them in a minute. The type halo on the next one shows what happens. You take your type positive, top right, you make a negative of it, as I showed you earlier, you duff it, and then you make a positive of it, thickening up the line gauge a bit so that it's bigger than the type itself. Then you use that as a halo so that you break the black line work and the blue line work, etc., for the lettering, and you can see the composite effect of that on the final one. You wouldn't be able to read the town names if they were sitting across the names without a halo. Now, a peelcoat, there we go, look at that. There's somebody, this is from USGS, very kindly, has an image of a peelcoat, and he's peeling out a geological layer there, which would have been nicely coloured up on a sheet of paper. Editors used to love colouring, it was the easy bit. It had to be done so the draftsman knew which bits were which. Down below is the typesetting machine that I first started off with. It was a clickety-click job, and it put type onto a film, which was developed down in the darkroom, and it came back in the top right-hand corner, just at the edge of that scalpel, you'll see a little bit of type hanging there. The type was patched on a piece of clear film, and that stripping film was made onto a special surface of film which peeled off from a back of film, a very thin polyester layer. You peel it off, you wax it through a special machine, you stick it back down again, and you cut out the names as you want them and stick them on the map where you wanted them. Now you can imagine what that was like on a hot day when the wax wasn't behaving itself or it was too hot. There was one instance where one of our guys forgot to cover his map at the end of the day with film, and the next morning he had little tan spots of Saudi Arabia all over the desk. It was a dickens of a job working out where they would go, so it wasn't without hazard. Now, an interesting aside to this type stuff is we used to use a chemical called carbon tetrachloride. I think it's now got a multiple skull and crossbones sign on it, and we just had to stop using it before we moved on to electronic typing. It was quite dangerous times back then. Now there on the bottom right hand side is that example of a negative of the type that I showed you before. Now what do we have next? Oh yeah, I have a composite here of a map, and this is to illustrate what I mean by design specification, that the editor would sort out. The line work. The frame would be a black line. K is black, C is cyan, M is magenta, and Y is yellow. And they're all colours that you print from. I'll show that later as well. Now, the map above is a composite one without the background on it. And the specification and the combines don't show everything that's in there. It's just enough to give you a flavour of what we did back then. The key to map symbols on the right shows the freeway, primary highway, secondary highway, boundaries and so on. And you can see from the specification that line work for the frame should be 100% black and 4-point. You can see that on the map. The coastline should be cyan magenta mix. You can see a bit of that down in the middle of the sample. Appalachee Bay, you see above there, that's the coastline. The rivers in this sample are the same. The lakes are the same thickness and colour, but they've got a 20% cyan fill. Boundaries are purple. And the dicing, if you can look at the bit that's going centre across, that thick purple line that's broken, the broken line, that's what we call dicing. And that is 10-point by 5-point in today's jargon, but that would have been bits of millimetres back then. The county boundary is the little dotty ones below and all around, similar, thinner, but a smaller peck. Then if you look at the freeway, that's built up by, if you look third one down on the specification, it says casing, 4.5-point 60K. And then on top of that, there's the infill, which is 3.75-point 80 cyan, 20 magenta. On top of that, you've got a centre line, which is 0.75 white. And altogether, that makes your freeway. Similar with the primary highway, there would be the casing underneath and then the fill on the top. The fill being narrower than the casing so that you just see a little bit of grey line sticking out the side. Same for the other roads. Now, when I say combines were made from these, all that lot finally go to negatives, including the type, but we're just looking at line work here. Everything would go to negative. And the cameraman would then take the cyan, the coastline scribe, expose that to his film at 80% of cyan using the dot screen. There'll be one in the next slide, don't panic. Then you take the river scribe and do that at 85. He would take the lake scribe, do that at 85%. Take that away, put the lake film peel coat down and expose that at 20%. Then he would take the graticule scribe and put that down at 100%. He would take the state boundary line and put that down at 36, county boundary 36, and freeway fill at 80%. Similarly, the magenta would have the coast and its percentage, the river and its percentage, and so on. Right down to the black frame, which was the frame itself, and the casings for the other roads. So you can see there's a complicated thing there. I guarantee you these, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 elements to that cyan. There would be up to about 20 in some instances. So it was great concentration and very fastidious cleaning of everything by the camera operators to get this sorted out and make sure they come back clean. And that's where the darkroom comes in. The first thing the darkroom would do would maybe put the compilation, an image of that onto the scribe coat. If you go back to that orange slide where Dave was scribing away, the image of the roads compilation would have been put onto that down in the darkroom. Then once it was scribed, or once whatever was scribed, would go down there and peel coats would be made from the scribes, again in the darkroom. They would also develop the typesetting film that was done in the typesetter upstairs. They would make negatives of type and symbols and anything else. And they would do these combines that I was talking about earlier, mixing the colours together. Now, in order that you didn't get moire patterns, you would have to expose the different colours at different angles. Now, I've enlarged up a typical dot screen on the left to show you cyan, 40% dot. You can see it's a bigger dot than the 20% magenta dot, the smaller dot than the 50% yellow. So what the percentages means that that's the amount of colour there is within that square. And you can see how you combine one on top of the other to the other. And the second from the right sample shows 3 on top of each other. But when that's produced at the actual size, you get the khaki colour that you see there. All very clever, again, very time consuming. And this is what the cameraman was doing in the darkroom, making the films. Then he would make a 4-colour proof, and later on he would make the final films from those negatives if he didn't have to make the negatives again. Well, that was all fine and dandy. And then these things came along. In 1984, you can see the Mac was launched. They didn't do any graphics particularly. It's more type orientated. And then PageMaker came along. which started the desktop publishing revolution. You could do page layouts. Quickly after that, Quark Express came along in Illustrator, which was a graphics package. Quark Express was also a page layout publishing package. Freehand was launched, and that was a drawing package as well. I never experienced freehand, but apparently those who did use it thought it was far superior to the Illustrator. But Adobe finally acquired all this, so that was the beginning of the end of freehand. And the InDesign replaced PageMaker. I think it was a progression that PageMaker was just developed to a very high level and then became InDesign. Now today I use InDesign and Illustrator. Now this is a picture of not anything to do with the Mac. We didn't go down the Mac route where we were. We decided, you have to remember that at that time Mac didn't offer a very excellent graphics package that we could work with, so we went for LaserScan. The LaserScan system was a data capture system which was very, very sophisticated and very powerful. It would do automatic line tracing and so on, and a huge digitizing table there, and Ian is digitizing from a Northern Survey map which we paid the license for at that time, and he's creating the maps on screen there. So I remember they went on to a Mac after that to finish off. But then this was going on one side of the drawing office, and you can just see behind the top of that computer screen, there's Dave doing his scribing. So it was a funny mix, the latest technology in map making with the old-fashioned way going on at the same time. But then going back to Mac, we could now do our own phototype setting instead of sending it outside. We could print off maps for checking. Computers became cheaper, faster, and more powerful, and the graphics software developed. The internet came along, and the World Wide Web came along, and the really super duper fast web came along. And somewhere in the 2000s, a vendor introduced Map Publisher, which turned Illustrator into a GIS, Geographic Information System, which is what we use today. So where are we today? Computers are even more powerful. You can store a vast amount of spatial data. Software options are plenty. Data availability is plenty. Commercial GIS software companies still very important, and they provide solutions for spatial problems. But open source GIS software is becoming mainstream, where you don't pay for it, and they're very lively in developing this. The whole business nowadays is much more collaborative. Open data, for example, you get lots of free on survey data, would have been unheard of back then. And once upon a time, you would jealously guard everything you did, and you wouldn't show anything to anybody else in case they copied you. Now everybody shares, it's lovely. And also, we're no longer traditional mappers. Anybody can draw maps. And nowadays, we're talking about data visualization, where maps are just a small part of it. And when you've got data, maps need not necessarily be the best way to show data. Sometimes charts, graphs, animations are better. And that's where the future is lying. So to get a bit more personal now, I thought I'd take you through some of the stuff that I was doing while all this fantastic changes was going on. I first got a Mac and started doing page design and layout in PageMaker, and that was fine. I started doing adverts and flyers for the company in Quark Express. The maps were still being drawn manually in the drawing office, as well as data capture on the LaserScan system. So we had 3 systems going, Macs with editors using them for design, research and layout, and still scribing and peel coating and type hatching and LaserScan. It was a funny mix. But the draftsmen started using the Macs for pre-press finishing. And at this stage, when computers started coming in, editors often took fright and fled, thinking that the computers were for the draftsmen. But what I found in my experience was the draftsmen weren't necessarily good editors. They wouldn't do the selection, they wouldn't do the design specification. They could do all the mapping, but they weren't trained in all the other things because they'd been spoon-fed all that stuff. It's vastly different now, and I wouldn't dare say that a map maker doesn't know what he's doing these days. But back then, it was quite difficult for them to adapt. The editors, on the other hand, were quite keen to get stuck into the computers, so off they went. But a lot of them left. So what did I do then? I moved to a different company, Global Mapping. And this is the sort of thing I had to deal with there. This is a map that came in, and I was asked if I could do something about it. In other words, turn it into something reasonable. It was printed out as a proof, and I had lots of sheets of tracing paper, which I laid out and marked up for the draftsman to do these changes. It took me ages, and I redesigned the thing, so the backward-leaning type for the water features, you'll see some down the bottom there, wasn't so, that's not very European, so we turned it into italic the other way. I'm not sure what you call that backward slant italic, but we do it the other way to the right. And the town symbols are all higgledy-piggledy. Everything's cluttered. The railways are very odd. Roads, colours of it, the whole thing was a bit of a mess. So as I say, I had to mark all this up. Another one I had to deal with was something like this, which was a war map. You can see there's far too many roads on there. It was this data capture thing. We've got lots of roads, so we'll put them on there. No, editors need to take this out of there. We need to sort out what's necessary for this scale of map. And that's where the editors are really good at showing, selecting what's good for purpose and what's the map for and what size is it going to be. So I'm quickly going to show you what I did when I was given Adobe Illustrator and self-taught with help from Tim at XYZ to develop my own mapping. So I did it myself. This was one I did using Illustrator, getting data from Tim at XYZ, doing my own research and compiling it all and turning it into a nice map. Lots of different data sources there. We've got the plate boundaries and all the regions at risk and so on, volcanoes, earthquakes, all imported from data. Whew, that was very adventurous for me. And then the next one I did was the environmental world, which was another success with lots of insets there. And there I am, working on the environmental world, back in my old place. Then I got Map Publisher, really got stuck into that. And here we have the result. Another nice map, done in the old-fashioned style. And this one was based on Ordnance Survey open data. That was my first foray into taking different data sets and making them sit together, which isn't always easy. And as I say, I do bits and bobs for global mapping now, but I also work for other people. And here's an example of something I did for a company called Tiger Moon, the educational publishers. And I know you can't see that very clearly on there, but it's amazing what you learn when you're researching for something. You just give them a free rein, off you go, research it, find out what you can. I didn't know, for example, that Magellan was not the first person to circumnavigate the world because he was killed on the Philippines in 1521. Elcano was the first person to circumnavigate the world. Now, did you know that? A couple of other things there, examples of the insets. Now, when I'm not doing maps, what was I doing? All this stuff that Chris mentioned behind the scenes at the BCS. I started doing the flyers back in 2006. And another thing about changing technologies, it lets you do so much more and so much more quickly. Look at the difference in styles between the 2006 flyer top left and the 2018 flyer next to it. Ditto the Cartography and Introduction first edition to the new edition, and then we've got banners and such like. I did that for ages for BCS. But apart from cartography, I do other things. And this is all based on my experience with Quark Express and InDesign. My other half, Graham, is a writer and broadcaster, and he's big into inland waterways and also glass. So I've done all these books, posters, flyers, publicity things for him. And there's never a dull moment. And in my spare time, I walk the dogs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that. That's been a very interesting and very thorough talk of your of the
I'm
changes.
sorry it's gone on a bit long.
It's no problem. Yes.
Have we
So
lost anybody on the way?
we've still got most people here. Right. So now we'll move on to the questions. First question we have: what was the largest size map sheet that you worked on? How did you reconcile one sheet with the next?
What was who's asked that question? Do we know?
The last question?
Do we know who's asked the question?
That was Arthur Allen.
Oh, sorry, don't know him. The large, was 40 inches by 60 inches. And on the punch register system, you know that picture I showed you of the little Kodak, it was for a 10 by 12 thing. We had punch register systems as big as the drawing tables. And you would have half a dozen holes along there. But the registration was always a problem at that size. And because you can imagine you've got these pins and a row along the top, and then 40 inches below that you've got the rest of the map. And although the film was reportedly very stable, it did move a bit. And when you came to combine elements together, sometimes the registration was a serious problem. And that's where the draftsman would do this touching up of final films to get rid of the little bits of screen that had gone over the coastline and so on.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I can see. I can see that quite a few of our the people watching the talk have had a lot of thorough experience with everything you've been doing. So it's very interesting. It's been very interesting seeing the comments. So, okay, and here's the next question.
Some of the comments, yeah.
Yes, here's the next question we have.
Well, somebody says going home with tight patching stuck to your arms on a hot day. Absolutely, yes. Working out where it goes the next day when you come back. Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, so our next question is what was the word we used to calibrate the Dynatype machine?
Haven't a clue. I didn't do it. Sorry. It's a bit technical. Yeah, I was on the techie side of it.
So it seems So that well, hopefully we'll mates find out at one point. Okay, so one question. What got you interested in maps at the beginning?
Oh, that was at school. Secondary school, we had a geography teacher who inspired us all. He was brilliant. He would take us out on field trips long before we were ever imagined. Imagine in the 60s going out in his old jalopy, half a dozen of us piled in there down to the cliffs to look at the conglomerates in Stonehaven. It wouldn't be seen today, would it? But health and safety would not permit it. But yeah, he would start off every geography class with drawing a map on the board in chalk. And then he would label the map of, for example, France, where the vines were and where the rivers were. And that just hooked me on maps right from then. And I completely studied geography totally from a map. It was always the first point for me, was draw the map and then write about it. So that's what got me interested in maps, because I could really understand it. And for my sixth form project, I drew a map on paper of Francis Chichester's Round the World Voyage and Gypsy Moths. And that was a great long strip of paper, which I just carried on.
Yes, I have to say, I developed quite an interest myself at school. There was geography at school. There's a lot of mapping, and that you're shown a lot of mapping at least, and
yes,
it really sets everything in context. So it can drive. I think it's driven a lot of us to taking up cartography.
Helps, doesn't it? Yeah.
Okay, right. So, another question. You mentioned open data sets. What difficulties did you encounter, and were you successful?
Oh, difficult. Any specific open data sets or general? No, general. Whatever I try to use open data. It's often incomplete. I'm not talking about on a survey here. I dare not say that. But some data is incomplete, inaccurate, out of date. I had an example once many years ago of getting data for Orlando, and I was partway through using it when I realised it didn't have Disneyland on it. So, oops. So when you get data, first you have to verify it. And I do that by checking out an area against another area that I know is good, and just keep cross-referencing and taking one set of data and matching with another. They don't always match. For example, one source will have the boundaries in one place, and you'll take your rivers from another source which should follow the boundaries, and they don't. So then you're in a pickle and you have to work out which is right. So there are hazards in using open data, but no more than in doing research and compiling in the original way. And this is where the editorial background I've got is really useful. It helps me know what to look for and how to identify what's good and what isn't good. Same when you're researching on the internet. You will still find, for example, that hundreds of sites say that Magellan was the first to circumnavigate the world. And people just swallow it up and believe it. You're taught that in school, haven't you? So it's buyer beware, or free person beware.
Yes. So, right. Okay, so what was your favourite scale of mapping to work on?
And the world maps. The sort of 20 million, even 10 million maps, because you're pulling together so much information. And you saw that Discoveries map there. Just the challenge of making it interesting enough without overloading it. That's a real skill, that you've got all that information, but if you put it all on there, it's going to be illegible. So you have to weed out what's important, like the most important things one features. But quickly, I'll say after that, my next favourite project was working on school atlases. I loved the consistency of one page to the next, and the scales, going up and down the scales, and the different designs. I love that.
Very, very interesting to hear that, and I can appreciate the world's the maps on the world level. That's
well, you can see the ones I've showed you. I've done.
Yes, I have.
They're all world maps.
Yes. Okay. So here we are. So another question. So again, people expressing that they've really enjoyed your talk at this point. So really interesting to hear how your career has seen many changes. Is there a particular time and aspect of map making you enjoyed most?
Getting to terms with GIS. I wasn't scared of it. I had good teachers in Tim. I keep mentioning Tim at XYZ, but he was a godsend to me. Just long suffering. How do I do this, Tim? How do I do that? And then gradually, as I say, I was self-taught. I would just practice until I got it right. And every day I'm discovering new things. The only thing that I have no regret, it's kind of sad, but with this data visualization, animation, I'm quite envious of the folks that are doing that now, because if I'd been quite a few years younger, I would have been into that. I would have been into GIS right from the beginning. But I have no regrets. I enjoyed my time doing what I'm doing, and I didn't get where I am without going through all that lot.
Okay. We have another question, and by coincidence going into talking about data visualization. So what skill do you think would be most important for people new to the industry to get to grips with in map making / data visualization?
Oh, that's an impossible question. It depends what the topic is. If it's data for statistical analysis, it would depend on the size of the country and so on. I'm sorry, I can't say. It would vary totally. You could have a 10,000, 1 to 10,000 scale map of a town and use that to show traffic moving around, or you could have a world map showing airplanes flying around. So it is totally dependent. It's what I was saying earlier. Every map has to be made to suit the purpose for which it's intended, and that determines how you do it and what you produce.
Yes, it's quite a large and varied case when it comes to data. Yes. as you showed with some of the examples of information overload with where someone's trying to put too much information on the map, and it's
yes, you end up with a mess.
Okay, well, we have to say thank you very much, Mary, for that. It's been a very interesting talk, and it's
thank you very much.
And I can see that, as I've said before, you seem to have brought back a lot of memories to a lot of people. Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank Mary once again for an interesting talk, and I hope that you'll join us for future talks. Our next talk will be from Stuart Auckland, with his talk on the drink map of Oxford. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you and goodbye.